There is a building in Queens that you have probably already driven past. It sits maybe 200 feet from the Grand Central Parkway, and if you have ever taken that road east toward Long Island, past the strip malls, past the cemetery off Jamaica Avenue, past the point where the highway lifts slightly, and you can see over the tree line into a flat institutional sprawl. You have seen its roof. A 5-story brick structure, long as a city block, with a water tower above it that stopped turning years ago. Most people clock it as a hospital, maybe a factory. The windows on the upper floors are blown out on the eastern face, and in the morning the light passes straight through the building from one side to the other, so that from the highway you can see the sky through what used to be rooms. You don't slow down. There is nowhere to slow down. You pass it at 63 miles per hour, and you don't think about it again. Inside, on the 4th floor, right now, as of the last time anyone went in, there are patient files on the floor. Not a few. Not a neat stack that fell from a shelf. Hundreds of them, scattered across the linoleum like something overturned in a hurry. Folders with tabs, paper records going back to the 1940s, full legal names, diagnoses, written out in the blunt medical language of mid-century psychiatry, medication schedules, next-of-kin contact information, personal notes from psychiatrists, some in ink that has bled through the paper from rain that entered through the broken windows, photographs, in some of the older files, a woman in a print dress seated for her intake photo, looking somewhere to the left of the camera. Rain has warped the pages into curves. Rats have nested in the corners, pulling at whatever was soft enough to carry. Mold has climbed the south wall and begun working its way into the cabinets that no longer close. Some files have turned to pulp entirely. There is no recovering what they said. Others are still legible. You can still read the names. No one has locked the door. That is not a metaphor. The door to at least one wing of Building 25 at Creedmoor Psychiatric Center in Queens, New York, is not secured against entry. Urban explorers have been photographing it for 20 years. The photographs circulate. Journalists have written about it. Local politicians have been asked about it. The building is still there. The files are still there. The question of who is responsible for them has not been answered by any agency with the authority to answer it. This is a story about how that building got that way. About the 7,000 people who lived inside this campus at its peak, and the decisions made by doctors, politicians, and bureaucrats that emptied it, and what happened to the people who left. And it is a story about a woman I will call Sylvia Parks, a composite drawn from documented case histories, court records, and the testimonies of former patients and staff, who arrived at Creedmoor in the spring of 1955 and did not leave for 30 years. She walked in, carrying a brown paper bag. Inside it, one change of clothes, a pair of slippers, and a photograph of her mother taken at Coney Island sometime in the late 1930s. Her mother is squinting into the sun. Sylvia was 26 years old. She had a small scar through her left eyebrow from a childhood fall, and she had not slept in 4 days. And when they brought her to the intake ward, she sat down in the plastic chair and folded her hands in her lap and waited. Because that was what she had always done when she did not know what else to do. She did not know. Sitting there. What the chair was the beginning of. Creedmoor opened in 1912 as a farm colony, a subsidiary of the Brooklyn State Hospital, established on 330 acres of Queens farmland as a working agricultural site where patients would grow their own food and, in theory, grow healthier alongside it. The farm colony model was progressive by the standards of its era. It was not a dungeon. It was not a snake pit. The men who designed it believed, with genuine sincerity, that clean air and physical labor and distance from the city would restore disordered minds to order. They were wrong about the mechanism, and partly right about the outcome. For a while, for some patients, under specific conditions that couldn't be replicated at scale. The smell in the morning, in the early years of the farm, was hay and manure and something medicinal underneath it. Camphor or carbolic, wafting from the laundry building where they boiled the linens. Patients who worked the fields described, decades later, the particular quality of the light over the Queen's Flatlands at 6 in the morning, the way it came in low and orange and made the furrows in the soil look deeper than they were. Some of them liked it. Some of them liked it the way you can like something and still not want to be there. The population grew. In 1912, Creedmoor housed a few hundred patients. By 1940, it housed nearly 4,000. By the early 1950s, it was pushing 6,000, and the farm was becoming incidental, a supplement to a sprawling institutional complex of brick dormitory buildings, covered walkways, an auditorium, a chapel, a post office, a fire station staffed by patients, a beauty parlor, a bakery that produced bread for the entire campus. The scale of it is genuinely difficult to hold in the mind. 7,000 people living on a campus in Queens, visible from the highway, invisible to the city. Ward C of Building 7, where Sylvia was taken after intake, smelled of floor wax and something sour underneath it that the wax could not cover. The beds were close enough together that if you reached your arm out at night, you could touch the next one. Women on Sylvia's ward ranged from teenagers to women in their 80s, and the noise level after lights out was a specific kind of layered sound. Murmuring, occasional sharp vocalizations, the percussion of someone knocking a fist against the bed frame in a steady rhythm that stopped and started and stopped again. Sylvia lay on her back and listened to it, and thought about her mother's apartment in Brownsville, the sound of the radiator at night, the particular creak of the third step on the staircase. The ward psychiatrist who assessed her on her third day was a young resident who wrote in his notes, with genuine clinical confidence, that her presentation was consistent with schizophrenic reaction, paranoid type, and that she required long-term institutional management. He was 29 years old. He had never met her before this 30-minute interview. He would not meet her again for 14 months. She was given a diagnosis that would follow her for the rest of her life. It is printed, right now, in a water-damaged folder on the floor of Building 25. The hospital she entered in 1955 was a hospital in crisis, in ways that almost no one inside it would admit openly. The wards were overcrowded by margins that made genuine treatment nearly impossible. The ratio of psychiatrists to patients at New York State's hospitals in the early 1950s was, in some wards, 1 physician for every 200 patients. Not 200 on a given day. 200 as a caseload. These were people whose primary contact with the medical system that held legal authority over their lives was a physician who might see them for 20 minutes every 2 weeks, who was managing 200 other such appointments, who was documenting everything in notes that would be filed and rarely revisited. The doctors were not monsters. Most of them went into psychiatry because they believed in it. Most of them had read Kraepelin and Bleuler and the newer psychoanalytic literature, and believed, as their training had instructed them to believe, that the human mind was an object that could be studied and, with sufficient rigor, repaired. What they lacked was not intention. What they lacked was time and resources, and more fundamentally, any treatment that actually worked. Insulin coma therapy had come through in the 1930s. Patients were put into hypoglycemic coma repeatedly over weeks, on the theory that the shock to the system would reset disordered neural patterns. The evidence for it was never solid. The side effects included death. Electroconvulsive therapy was in use in the wards by the early 1950s, and unlike insulin coma, it persisted because it demonstrably helped some patients with severe depression. But for the vast, undifferentiated population filling the wards of Creedmoor, patients with schizophrenia, with what would now be recognized as bipolar disorder, with severe anxiety, with intellectual disabilities, with epilepsy, with alcoholism, with behavior that was disruptive enough to warrant commitment, and not much more specific than that. There was no reliable treatment. There was management. Then the samples arrived. In 1954, a drug called chlorpromazine, trade name Thorazine, was approved by the FDA. It had been developed in France 2 years earlier and had moved through clinical trials with a speed that reflected the desperation of the field more than the robustness of the data. The early reports from European hospitals were extraordinary. Patients who had been uncontrollably agitated for years became calm. Patients who heard voices described the voices as quieter, more distant. The delusions did not disappear exactly, but they seemed to recede behind a kind of gauze, still there but no longer loud enough to command behavior. Dr. Henry Brill was at the time the Deputy Commissioner of the New York State Department of Mental Hygiene, and he had been watching the European results with the focused attention of a man who oversees a system housing 80,000 patients in a state that is spending a larger and larger percentage of its budget, keeping those patients fed and housed, and not dead. He was a serious researcher. He was also a bureaucrat who understood, with the clarity that comes from reading budget documents, that the state hospital system was financially unsustainable. He moved quickly. Creedmoor was among the first New York hospitals to begin administering Thorazine in 1955, the same year Sylvia arrived. The drug worked. That is the honest statement. And it has to come first before anything else. Because the failure to say it plainly is its own kind of distortion. Thorazine worked for a meaningful portion of patients in meaningful ways. Wards that had been physically dangerous, where staff entered in pairs, where patients struck each other and the walls and themselves, became quiet. Patients who had been in physical restraints for years were freed from them. The hospital, which had smelled of fear underneath everything else, began to smell more neutrally of wax and cafeteria, and the particular flat odor of a building full of people who don't go outside much. The change was real. Sylvia received her first dose of Thorazine in the spring of 1956. She was sitting in the day room off Ward C when the medication nurse came around with the small paper cups. The nurse's name, according to ward logs from that period, was recorded only as M. Harrigan, R.A.N. She appears in dozens of patient files from that year as the administering nurse for the first chlorpromazine doses on Ward C. What she said when she handed Sylvia the cup is not recorded. What Sylvia said back is not recorded. There is only the notation, dose administered, patient compliant. The effect for Sylvia came over 3 days. Not like a switch, more like a radio being slowly turned down. The internal noise that had structured her waking life, the voices, the imperative quality of certain thoughts, the sense of being observed and interpreted by forces she could not name, became something she was aware of, rather than something she was inside. She could hear it. She could know it as something separate from herself. For the first time in years, she was aware of the room she was in. The yellow paint on the day room wall, the particular scrape of the metal chairs on the linoleum. Another patient, a woman with white hair cut very short who was knitting something green, and who hummed while she did it. Sylvia sat across from her for an hour one afternoon and said nothing, and the woman did not look up. The humming was tuneless and steady and real. Better today? The nurse asked her at medication time on the 4th morning. Sylvia thought about the question. I can see the wall, she said. The nurse marked something in the chart and moved on. The exchange, abbreviated in the nursing notes as patient verbal, oriented ×2, mood improved, does not capture what Sylvia meant by what she said. She meant, For a long time, the wall had not been something she could see plainly, as a wall with nothing attached to it. She meant, this is what other people feel like. I think this is what normal feels like. She was not cured. Thorazine is not a cure. Nobody in 1956 was using the word cure, even if the atmosphere in the hospital and in certain newspaper accounts of the drug's arrival had something of the quality of a cure narrative. The language of breakthrough, of transformation, of the hospital emptied at last. The quieting of symptoms is not the same as the resolution of the underlying condition. But Sylvia, on Thorazine, could sit in a chair and see the room and know where she was. That was a form of relief so large she had no word for it. The ward changed around her. In 1955, the year she arrived, Creedmoor's population was approaching its peak. By 1960, it had begun to fall. The patients leaving were not primarily patients who had been cured. They were patients whose symptoms were managed well enough that the hospital could argue they did not require inpatient care. The drug had not solved the problem. It had changed the problem's shape. Here is the thing that the reformers would say a decade later, and they would say it sincerely, and they would be right and also terribly wrong at the same time. The state hospital system, as it existed in the 1950s and early 1960s, was doing real harm to real people. This is documented and not disputed by anyone who has read the literature carefully. Patients were admitted for conditions that were not psychiatric illnesses by any defensible standard. Patients were held for years without review. Patients were subjected to treatments, lobotomy, insulin coma, prolonged physical restraint, that caused suffering and frequently caused permanent damage. The institutional logic of the large state hospital tended toward custody rather than treatment, toward managing behavior rather than addressing its causes, toward the convenience of the institution rather than the welfare of the person inside it. These were real failures. They happened here. The records are in the building, and so when a new philosophy arrived in the late 1950s and early 1960s, community mental health, deinstitutionalization, the idea that patients could and should live outside institutional walls in their own communities, supported by local mental health centers and outpatient services and group homes and the human infrastructure of ordinary life. It arrived as a moral argument, and the moral argument was genuinely correct, and the people making it mostly believed it, and it destroyed the lives of tens of thousands of people. President Kennedy signed the Community Mental Health Act in 1963. The legislation was, in its framing, a revolution in how the country thought about mental illness. The state hospital, the brick fortress on the edge of town, the institution that swallowed people and held them for decades and called it treatment, was to be replaced by a network of community mental health centers, close to home, responsive to individual need, humane in ways the old system had never managed. The centers would be funded, built, and staffed. The patients would be freed. The hospitals would empty. The centers were not built. Not nearly enough of them. Not with anywhere near the funding the legislation had implied. The money that was supposed to follow the patients into the community was redirected, absorbed, never allocated. The political will that had passed the legislation did not survive the series of crises that followed it through the 1960s and into the 1970s. Vietnam, urban uprisings, the collapse of the Great Society programs, the fiscal catastrophe that nearly killed New York City in 1975. By the time the deinstitutionalization movement was in full swing, emptying hospitals across the country at a rate that accelerated sharply in the late 1970s, the community infrastructure that was supposed to receive the discharged patients existed mainly on paper. At Creedmoor, the population that had peaked at over 7,000 in 1959 fell to 5,000 by 1970, to 2,500 by 1980. The buildings emptied in stages. Wards that had been locked and supervised became storage. Equipment was moved and not replaced. Staff levels fell faster than the population did, which meant that the patients who remained were those whose symptoms were most severe, receiving care from a workforce that was shrinking around them in a physical plant that was beginning to show the particular kind of institutional decay that happens when maintenance budgets are cut slowly over many years. The ceilings that develop a stain, and then the stain grows, and then the plaster begins to separate, and someone puts a bucket under it, and the bucket becomes permanent. The philosophy of the reformers was not the engine of this. The engine of this was cost. New York State, in fiscal crisis for most of the 1970s, discovered that discharging a patient from a state hospital was dramatically cheaper than maintaining one. The cost comparison was not hidden. It was stated, in budget documents and policy papers, as a justification for accelerated deinstitutionalization. The humane language and the financial logic ran in the same direction at the same time, and the people holding the humane language were not always aware, or chose not to be aware, of who was really steering. Janet Cohen began working as a social worker at Creedmoor in 1981. She was 24 years old, and she had a master's degree from Hunter College, and she had read the literature on community care, and she believed in it. She had a small office in the administrative building that smelled of cigarette smoke from the previous occupant, and a filing cabinet that was already so full when she arrived that she had to force the drawers closed. Her job, officially, was discharge planning. She was responsible for identifying patients who could be transitioned to community care and arranging that transition. Arranging meant finding a group home with an available bed. It meant calling the community mental health centers that were supposed to receive these patients and confirming that there was outpatient psychiatric care available to continue medication management. It meant completing a discharge packet, a stack of forms several inches thick, that documented the patient's current medications, their diagnosis, their functional capabilities, their identified housing placement, their designated outpatient provider. The housing placements were single-room occupancy hotels in neighborhoods that had been designated for adult home development in the 1970s, when the city had needed somewhere to put a large number of people being discharged from state hospitals and had not built the group homes, and had instead negotiated arrangements with SRO owners in specific zip codes, East New York, the South Bronx, certain parts of Brooklyn and Queens, to accept mentally ill residents with Medicaid as payment. The rooms were small. The staff in most of them were not clinicians. The medication management that was supposed to continue through outpatient services frequently didn't, because the outpatient centers were overwhelmed or underfunded, or, in some cases, simply not reachable by patients who lacked the executive functioning to navigate a phone system and make and keep appointments. Janet knew this. She knew it not abstractly, but concretely. She had been to the SRO hotels. She had walked the halls where the carpet had been replaced with bare plywood, and the doors didn't lock from the inside, and the communal bathroom served 14 rooms. She had met the managers, who were not unkind, but who were running a rooming house and not a mental health facility, and who would tell you plainly, if you asked them, that they could not manage a psychiatric crisis. She had sat in intake meetings at the community mental health centers and understood the waiting lists, and she kept signing the forms. The pressure was not subtle. The hospital needed to reduce its census. The state needed to reduce its costs. The ideology of the moment said that discharge was liberation. Her supervisor, a man she respected, and who had been doing this work for 15 years, told her in their first meeting that her job was to get people out, and that was the best thing she could do for them, and that if she waited for a perfect placement, she would never get anyone placed. He was not wrong about the last part. She signed, and the patients left. And some of them did fine, for a while, in the SROs and the group homes, on their medications, with the thin support structure available to them. And some of them didn't. Sylvia had been on Ward C for 17 years when Janet Cohen arrived. She was 42 years old by then, and the ward had become, in the way that institutions become for people who live in them long enough, the only geography she knew how to inhabit. She knew where the drafts came in. She knew which floor tiles were loose. She knew the sound of the medication cart wheels on the linoleum, slightly uneven, one wheel that caught slightly before releasing. And her body responded to that sound before her mind registered it, so that her hand was already out, palm up, before she was fully conscious of the nurse's approach. Her files from this period describe her as a model patient, compliant with medication, occasionally helpful to staff, mild functional limitations. The language is clinical and flat, and does not contain any of what she was actually like, which we know only in fragments from the testimony of a former nurse who worked Ward C in the 1970s and described, in an oral history interview conducted in 1998, a patient who collected crossword puzzles torn from the newspaper and traded them with other patients like currency, and who had taught herself enough about plumbing from a maintenance manual left in the day room to fix a running toilet that had been reported unfixed for 4 months. She fixed it herself, the nurse said. Just went in there one morning and fixed it. The maintenance supervisor didn't know whether to be annoyed or impressed. She was not, by this point, acutely psychotic. The Thorazine had controlled her symptoms well for years, with periodic dose adjustments and some changes to her regimen in the mid-1970s when newer antipsychotics became available. She had, on the medication, something close to a stable life, narrow, institutionally bounded, deprived of the texture and self-determination that constitute an ordinary life, but stable. She knew people. She had routines. The photograph of her mother at Coney Island was taped to the inside of her bedside locker and had been there for 20 years. What she did not have, and had not had for so long that its absence had become structural, was anywhere else to be. When Janet Cohen's supervisor assigned her Sylvia's case in the spring of 1983, the file on Janet's desk was 4 inches thick. Janet read it over 2 days, making notes in the margin in her compressed handwriting. She found the 1955 intake assessment and the 1956 Thorazine notation and the years of nursing notes documenting compliance and stability and the absence of acute crisis. She found no documentation of any serious attempt at discharge planning in the previous decade. She visited Ward C on a Tuesday. Sylvia was at the table by the window, working on a crossword puzzle. She was wearing a blue cardigan that was slightly too large for her, the cuffs folded back twice. Her hair was gray, cut close to her head in the institutional style. She looked up when Janet introduced herself, and Janet noticed the directness of her gaze. Not hostile, but assessing. Measuring the distance between what this woman was about to say and what she actually meant. "They're talking about moving me," Sylvia said. "How did you know that?" "You're new, you have a clipboard, and you're looking at me like I'm a problem someone just put on your desk." She returned to the crossword. "What's a 6-letter word for futile?" Janet looked at her. "Hollow," she said. "No?" Sylvia counted letters. "Feckless, that's 8. She wrote something in the margin. "There's a woman on the 3rd floor who was discharged in October. She was back here in January. She came back because the group home closed, and she had nowhere to go, and she had a breakdown in a subway station." She did not look up. "Is where you're sending me different from where she went?" Janet did not answer immediately. "I need to find out what's available," she said finally. Sylvia nodded, the way you nod when someone has just confirmed something you already knew. The group home Janet eventually placed Sylvia in was located in a neighborhood in southeast Queens that had been developed in the 1950s and had declined significantly by 1983. Small brick houses with chain-link fences, a commercial strip on the main avenue with a high vacancy rate, a bus line that ran infrequently. The home itself was a converted two-family house with 9 beds, licensed by the state under the adult care facility standards that had been established in the late 1970s as the regulatory framework for the community care infrastructure that was receiving discharged patients. It was clean. The director, a Haitian woman in her 50s, named Mrs. Telemaque, ran it with a combination of genuine care and frank exhaustion. She had 2 staff members, 9 residents, a van she used to drive residents to their outpatient appointments when the bus wasn't running. The outpatient psychiatric services that were supposed to manage Sylvia's medication were located in a community mental health center 3 bus transfers away. The appointment availability, when Janet called to arrange follow-up, was 2 to 3 months out for new patients. She signed the forms anyway. She drove to the group home herself on Sylvia's discharge day and met Mrs. Telemaque and walked through the rooms and looked at the kitchen, which was clean, and looked at the bedroom Sylvia would have, which was small and had a window that faced a backyard with a single tree, and decided it was adequate. Not good. Not what the reform movement had promised. Adequate. She drove back to Creedmoor. Sylvia's discharge day was a Thursday in early June of 1985. She was 56 years old. She had been inside Creedmoor for 30 years. The paperwork was complete. Her medications had been dispensed in a brown bag, a 90-day supply, which was the standard, which assumed she would have an outpatient appointment within 90 days to continue the prescription. She had a bus pass. She had a letter from the hospital with Mrs. Telemaque's address and phone number and the address and phone number of the outpatient center. She had $60 in a state-issued check that she would need to cash. She had a plastic bag with her clothes and a box with the photograph of her mother from Coney Island, now 30 years old, the edges curled and the surface slightly faded. The nurse who processed her discharge that morning was not M. Harrigan, RN, who had administered her first Thorazine dose 29 years earlier. This nurse was younger, in her 30s, wearing scrubs instead of the white uniform of the earlier era. She handed Sylvia an envelope with the check and the bus pass and said, in a tone that was not unkind, that she should take care of herself. "Take care of myself," Sylvia repeated. The nurse looked up. "I'm sorry," Sylvia said. "I know what you mean." She took the envelope. The cab ride Janet had arranged to take Sylvia to the group home cost $14, and Janet paid for it herself because there was no line item in the discharge budget for transportation, and she was not willing to put Sylvia on 3 buses on her first day out. She sat in the front seat, and Sylvia sat in the back, and the cab took the Grand Central Parkway west. It was a clear morning, and the buildings of the Creedmoor campus were visible for a long time as they drove. The brick towers, the water tower, the long roof lines of the ward buildings going back from the highway in receding rows. Sylvia watched them through the window. Janet watched her watching them. "How does it feel?" Janet asked. A long pause. The highway noise. "Large," Sylvia said. "Everything is very large." The group home where Sylvia went was not a failure immediately. That is important to say. She settled in over the summer of 1985 with the careful, adaptive attention of a woman who had spent 30 years learning to read new environments. She learned Mrs. Telemaque's routines. She learned the other residents, their names, their habits, the texture of their particular difficulties. She got to her first outpatient appointment 11 weeks after discharge, 3 weeks before her medication would have run out, and the psychiatrist there, a young man who had a caseload of over 200 outpatient clients, reviewed her chart for 12 minutes and renewed her prescriptions and told her to come back in 3 months. She was managing. It was not the life she might have had, but she was in it. And the backyard tree was an oak that was enormous and old enough to have seen the neighborhood as farmland, and in the evenings she sometimes sat outside and watched the light change on it. The group home closed in March of 1987. Mrs. Telemaque's license was not renewed, not because of any specific documented failure, but because the regulatory agency had changed its standards, and the physical plant of the converted two-family house no longer met the updated code requirements for egress and fire suppression, and the cost to bring it into compliance exceeded what the Medicaid reimbursement rate would cover. The state gave 30 days' notice. 9 residents. 30 days. 3 of them had family who could receive them. 2 were transferred to another group home in a different borough with available beds. 2 were transferred to a shelter referral system, which is a bureaucratic phrase for they were referred to the New York City shelter system, which in 1987 was itself in crisis. Its capacity overwhelmed by a population that included a significant and growing percentage of people with serious mental illness who had been discharged from state hospitals into community care that had failed or never existed. Janet Cohen got the call about the closure on a Wednesday. She had left Creedmoor by then. She had taken a position with a nonprofit mental health advocacy organization in Manhattan, partly because she believed she could do more good in policy than in direct service, and partly because she had signed too many of those forms, and she knew it. She spent 3 days on the phone trying to find placements for the 9 residents. She found 7. Sylvia and one other woman were the 2 she could not place before the closure date. Sylvia's name appears next in the records of the adult shelter intake system at the Queens Center, which was housed in a former school building on Jamaica Avenue, as a resident beginning in April of 1987. She is listed in the intake form with her Creedmoor diagnosis and her outpatient provider. The outpatient provider, when the shelter intake worker called to notify them, reported that she had missed her last 2 appointments. The prescription, as of the intake date, had likely lapsed. The shelter system in New York City in 1987 was not equipped to manage psychiatric medication. It was not equipped to identify when a resident's mental status was deteriorating due to medication interruption. It was equipped to provide a bed and a meal, and, in theory, a case manager who was responsible for an average of 60 residents per caseworker. Sylvia, off her medication, began to decompensate. The speed of it, for someone who had been stable on a carefully managed regimen for 30 years, was a fall through ice. The distance between managed and unmanaged is not gradual when the underlying illness is severe, and the neurological adaptation to medication is that total. Within 6 weeks of her last dose, she was symptomatic in ways the shelter staff documented as agitation, confusion, and refusal of shelter services. She left the shelter in June of 1987. The record of where she went after that is gaps. There are several points in the following months where a woman matching her description appears in police encounter logs, in emergency room intake records, in the notes of outreach workers who documented encounters with individuals living on the streets in the vicinity of the Jamaica, Queens transit hub. The description: woman, late 50s, gray hair cut short, scar through left eyebrow, is consistent across 3 separate records over 18 months. None of these encounters resulted in hospitalization. The emergency rooms discharged her. The outreach workers documented offers of service that were declined, or, in one record, actively fled. She is not in the Creedmoor records after 1985. The apartment she never had was never found. The family, the next of kin listed in her original intake form from 1955, a sister, an address in Brownsville, appears in an Elmira, New York, phone directory from 1980 in a name that might be the same woman or might not, and the address produced no response to a letter. The photograph of her mother, taken at Coney Island. Whatever became of it. The system that created Sylvia's path was not a series of individual failures. It was a system designed, financially and structurally, to produce exactly this outcome. The state hospital had held her, imperfectly and at great harm, for 30 years, and then the system that replaced it failed to exist in the form that would have made her discharge something other than abandonment. The doctors were not evil. Janet Cohen was not evil. Dr. Brill was not evil. The maintenance of the hospital grounds was not evil. Or at least it did not begin that way. The system was the antagonist, and the system had no face. Building 25 at Creedmoor was constructed in the 1950s, at the peak of the hospital's expansion, as an administrative and record storage facility. When the hospital's population contracted, it was repurposed for various uses over the decades. By the mid-1990s, sections of it were no longer in active use. Maintenance on those sections was deferred, and the deferral became permanent. The building did not close with any formal announcement. It became inactive the way things at the edges of a contracting institution become inactive, gradually, without ceremony, by the accumulation of decisions not to spend money. The patient records in Building 25 are there because they were filed there and no one removed them. The question of legal custody over those records is genuinely unresolved. Under New York state law, patient records are confidential and must be maintained securely. The records in Building 25 are not maintained securely. The regulatory gap between the obligation to maintain them and the absence of any agency actively claiming responsibility for them has existed for decades without resolution. The Office of Mental Health has been asked about this. The questions have produced statements about ongoing facility management reviews that have not, as of the most recent inquiries, produced any action. A photographer who documents urban decay, I am not using her real name, and she knows this is being discussed here, entered Building 25 in the fall of 2022 through a ground floor window on the south face that had been accessible for years. She had been inside before. She was specifically going back because she had read, in a piece published by a local news outlet, that there were patient records in the building, and she wanted to document what she found before it deteriorated further, or before someone finally locked the doors. The room she entered on the 4th floor took her breath away, and not metaphorically. The smell hit her first. Wet paper, mold, the particular sweetness of decomposing organic material that is different from any other kind of rot. The floor was tacky under her boots. She turned on her headlamp. The files were not stacked, they were spread. The word that came to her later, describing it to a friend, was distributed, as if someone had opened the cabinets and swept them out all at once, except there was nobody to have done that. The cabinets had simply failed over years, and the files had spilled, and the spilling had continued, and what she was looking at was the slow gravity of 20 years of nobody doing anything. She photographed for 2 hours. She was careful not to touch the names where she could avoid it. In some cases, she moved a file with her foot to see what was under it. More files, always more files, the layering of them suggesting a depth she couldn't calculate. The filing cabinets along the north wall had separated from each other at the base, tilted slightly toward the room. One had a rusted drawer that was still closed. She did not open it. Near the window on the east face, the windows that you can see the sky through from the highway, she found a folder that had landed, or been placed, or had arrived there by the accumulation of some series of small movements over 20 years. Face up. The folder was dark with water damage on its edges, but the center was partly legible. There was a name. She photographed it. She did not post the name. She stood at the window for a moment and looked out at the parkway, at the cars moving east at 60, 65 miles per hour. The sound of the highway came through the broken window without obstruction. A steady mechanical wash that had been audible in this building for decades. Through all of it. Through all the years the wards were full and all the years they emptied. the highway going about its business outside and the hospital going about its own, and neither one particularly aware of the other. She climbed back out the window 20 minutes later. The folder was still on the floor. Creedmoor Psychiatric Center is still partially active. Approximately 500 patients receive care there currently in the buildings that have been maintained. There is a Children's Day treatment program. There is outpatient services. There is a museum on the grounds, maintained by patients and staff, that documents the history of the hospital with a directness that is genuinely unusual for an institution documenting its own past. The people who work there now are not responsible for what happened in the decades before they arrived. Some of them are doing real, difficult, important work. Building 25 is on the same campus. The records are still in it. The New York State Office of Mental Health is the agency with legal authority over the Creedmoor campus. The office is aware that Building 25 contains patient records. There is no public documentation of a remediation plan. The building appears on architectural survey documents for the campus. The records appear in no survey document that has been made publicly available. The Community Mental Health Act that Kennedy signed in 1963 remains law, amended many times, the framework for a system that never achieved what the legislation described and whose failures have been documented in enough academic literature to fill a library. The pipeline from state hospital to street, from ward to shelter, from managed illness to crisis. It did not end in the 1980s. The pathways are different now, and the volumes are different, and some of the supports that didn't exist in 1985 exist today, but the basic structural tension between the cost of genuine community care and the cheaper alternative of providing nominal care and hoping the gaps don't show did not resolve. It persisted. It is in the budget documents right now, in whatever fiscal year you are reading this. Sylvia Parks is a composite. The name is not real. The experience is drawn from documented case histories, court testimony, oral history interviews with former patients and staff, and the records of advocacy organizations that documented deinstitutionalization's consequences in real time. She is not one woman. She is several dozen women, and the same number of men, and the particulars, the crossword puzzles, the photograph from Coney Island, the conversation about a 6-letter word for futile, are invented to carry a truth that the raw institutional record renders in language too flat to hold. The files on the floor of Building 25 are real. Some of them belong to people who are still alive. Some of them belong to people whose families have never been told that their loved one's full psychiatric history, their diagnosis and their medications, and the notes written about them in the most private moments of the most difficult years of their lives, is currently accessible to anyone willing to climb through a window in Queens. Nobody owns those records in any functional sense. Nobody is protecting them. The rain comes in through the broken windows, and the water finds the paper, and the paper loses its shape. And what was once someone's name becomes an illegible darkening at the edge of a page. The highway is right there. You have driven past it. The brick face, and the blown-out windows and the water tower that stopped turning and the grass coming up through the parking lot asphalt in the particular uncontrolled way that grass comes up when nobody has maintained a thing for a long time. You passed it at 63 miles an hour and you thought, hospital, factory, something whatever it is, now you know what it is. The names are still in there.